Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Shobhankita Reddy. I'm a researcher in technology geopolitics at the Takshashila Institution. And for this episode, I'm joined by Anindita. Anindita is a research associate at CSEP's Foreign Policy and Security Studies. And here we are to discuss critical minerals and what India has been doing in terms of international partnerships to secure access and reliable supply chains as it pertains to critical minerals. Anindita, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you so much, Shobhita. I'm really glad to be a part of this and happy to dive in. I've heard so many of these podcasts, and I'm really glad to be one of the guests here today. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to first understand the broader picture, right? Which is there's just been so much international attention to critical minerals since around July 2023, when China first instituted export controls on germanium and gallium specifically. Mm-hmm. But of course, over the last 18 months or so, we have seen different versions of these export controls. They have expanded, they have retracted. There's been pause in some of these enforcements from the Ministry of Commerce in China. And so this does look like a fragile situation. But meanwhile, Trump has also done his fair share to bringing critical minerals to the limelight and, just making splashy headlines. So I want to understand in two specific contexts. Mm-hmm. One is as it pertains to US and Ukraine, and second, as it pertains to Greenland. Because the temporary deal, whatever it was that US and Ukraine had, looked to sign, and of course that unraveled pretty quickly at that point in time, was around Ukraine's mineral resources. And among the many reasons why Trump says he wants to capture Greenland is also because the island has great reserves of rare earths. So how real are these reserves? What is the merit to some of these claims? And in your own research, what really comes out of what's going on behind the scenes here?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I think, like you said, this has been in the news quite a bit. And I think that might actually have been the first time people heard about critical minerals, what they are, why they're important. And like you mentioned, in the context of these two specific countries, I think in the Ukraine case, it came into the limelight due to the war. And the case of Ukraine's critical minerals has been a concern for both Europe and the US. And when the deal had happened, there was a lot of conversation on getting access to these. So all of these kind of stem from what you said in the beginning. China's export controls. So around the whole concept of critical minerals and why countries are even going ahead with inking these partnerships, it all stems from the fact that China controls most of the supply chains for these. They have access to a lot of them. They control the processing. And control, I mean, they just have most of the processing capabilities. So close to 60 to 70% of processing for rare earths and a lot of these other minerals, which include lithium, nickel, cobalt. A lot of them are key minerals for energy transition, for renewable energy and different technologies like electric vehicles. So primarily because they're the key supplier, countries are a little hesitant to be completely relied on these. And I think this came about in 2010. That's when there was the first export ban that China had placed on Japan due to some geopolitical issues. So stemming from all of that and everything else that's happened, that has led to a lot of these cases coming to light. And in the case of Ukraine, I think, like you said, the deal kind of fell through, mostly because, like we've known, Ukraine and Russia have been at war. And most of the deposits in Ukraine are in this contested region. So even though they do have a lot of these deposits, accessing them becomes a little difficult. And there's a lot of risk. So there's infrastructure damage in Ukraine in these regions because it's already contested. There is security risks alongside all of this. And there's no commercial development capability currently. So there's been a lot of delay. So even if they do have reserves, there is some hesitancy of how it'll actually proceed. And because of those reasons, the deal kind of fell through, and there's been a lot of issues with Ukraine being able to kind of get hold of the resource wealth that it has. And in the case of Greenland as well, we've seen a lot of the conversation. There's apparently well documented evidence that they have rare earths, uranium, and a lot of these other metals. And I think it is viable for Greenland to have them. I am not making a case or advocating for the US going ahead. And I mean, their claims are what they're claiming. But when it comes to India and where India kind of features into all of these conversations, is that for India, I think we have been hedging a lot of the bets. We have a lot of different partnerships. We have not looked at Ukraine particularly. We have our other partners that we're more in touch with. And I think all of these things are often, like you said, splashy, kind of newsworthy discussions. What actually happens behind everything and how tangible a lot of these things are things that we have to kind of take into consideration. But these countries do have the reserves and resources, and they can potentially use them for their own development when they have the capacity and the time for it. So.
Yeah, I think part of the interest is also because it sounds sexy, right? I mean, critical minerals and securing US's supply chains via partnerships with these countries. But I think the other one might also be just outsourcing pollution, which is what the West has done with outsourcing that first with China. And then since 2018, China is now an importer of rare earth materials, and they do more processing and value-added manufacturing within their borders. So we see how critical minerals are super key for decarbonization and also for our modern life as we know it. But their supply chains increasingly need to be away from urban developed centers because of just the pollution and the negative externalities associated with them. So maybe there's something to do with that. Or maybe, and I'm speculating here, maybe something about critical minerals has then to do with defense budgets increasing and the fact that so many of these minerals are also useful for defense applications, right? And maybe that dual use sort of plays into their appeal as well. But I want to ask you about India's international partnerships, right? Because there's been a flurry of activity from the Indian side, and these are both bilateral and plurilateral. And I found your report on this quite insightful, and I'll link a report in the show notes here. But just to understand a very broad overview from you as to what India has been doing. Firstly, are international partnerships key to India's mineral resilience? Are domestic reserves and capabilities sufficient? I want you to first illuminate as to why it is so important that India actually implements and tries to operationalize some of these agreements. And secondly, what these agreements even are.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm really glad you went through the report that me and Dr. Xavier had worked on. And I think to answer your question, are these partnerships important? I think the title of the paper kind of speaks to that, which says it's partnerships for self-reliance. And there's this whole understanding in India that we want to be self-reliant. There's Vikasit Bharat, Atmanirbhar Bharat. But I think within the institutional structure also, there is a recognition that at least in the short to near medium term, you do need to partner with other countries. And self-reliance is not something that means completely isolating yourself from everybody else. We still live in a geopolitical world. There's a lot of different dependencies. And like you mentioned on what India's own domestic reserves are, so as of right now, there's a lot of speculation that we do have potentially many of the minerals that, say, Australia or African countries have, because our geology is very similar, but there's been not enough exploration done within the country. And the National Critical Minerals Mission, the Ministry of Mines, and all of these other different bodies that have now come up and have been taking more of standing in this whole space are now moving towards that. So the Geological Survey of India as well, GSI, has been responsible for doing a lot of the mapping exercises to actually understand what the geological potential in India is. And that is where we stand. But there is still relatively limited budget for exploration, and that is something that my colleagues at CSEP have also been advocating for. And I think the government has now been moving towards that. So in the beginning, I think what India needs to do domestically is to first map out and explore what we have within the country. But like we mentioned, critical minerals are cross-cutting. You need them across different sectors. Like you mentioned, there's defense, there's clean energy, there's pharmaceuticals, there's various other requirements that we need them for. And we don't have them. So the Ministry of Mines had come out with the list of critical minerals in June 23. And in that, and even in the later chapters that have come out, we are almost 100% import reliant on most of these minerals. And for that, I think there's a sense and understanding within the government institutional architecture that we do need to partner with other countries to be getting these minerals. And like you said, there's a flurry of partnerships that we've had. I think one of the most tangible ones. So in our paper, we've mapped all of this out. There's an entire table you must have seen where we've seen what are the different sectors that these partnerships kind of go through and how deep they are or how shallow they are. We've mapped it and kind of tabulated all of that. So if anybody is interested, they can take a look. And but out of these, I think the most tangible ones that have moved forward with Australia and Japan as of right now, because these are also some of the most long-standing ones on critical minerals. With Japan, we don't have a specific MOU, but we have been working with them since 2011 with IREL, which is the Indian Rare Earths Limited, which is the PSU, which has been doing a lot of the rare earths work. And with Australia, we have everything embedded now. We have a critical minerals investment partnership as well. And we also have a lot of development within the Economic Comprehensive Trade Agreement. So within the ECTA, that we have a lot of our partnerships moving forward. We also have a research hub. So there's a lot of R&D happening in that sector as well. And this has some of the most advanced sort of developments. We have other countries where we have MOUs. So with the US, we have an MOU which we signed 2 years ago. And in that, it had seen a lot of discussion. There was a lot of potential for that. But then we had the tariffs and trade issues that came up. But now, again, with the trade deal, things seem to be moving forward. So with the US, we also have something called the trust framework. And within that is where we have the critical minerals discussion happening now. And we have a strategic mineral recovery program, which specifically looks at recycling, which is, again, all downstream. And with the EU, we have the Trade and Technology Council, within which we have a lot of this embedded. And so all of this I've been discussing has been more downstream. Australia is both, is upstream and downstream, because Australia is also a resource hub for many of these. But we also have different partnerships. We have CABIL, which has been the arm for international cooperations on critical minerals. They have an office on the ground in Argentina. We have a very solid partnership with Argentina right now, and they've started mining lithium brine blocks because we have the technology for that as well. And so there's a lot of tech issues also that come into critical minerals, and having the technology becomes very important to be able to refine and process, as you must know. And we have a lot of partnerships with different African countries as well. I think with Zimbabwe, GSI has gone in to start mapping a lot of the potential there. I have another colleague at CSEP who has been looking at Africa and India's critical mineral cooperation specifically. So if anybody is interested in that, they can take a look as well. And beyond just bilateral, we have been engaging in different fora as well. So there's minilateral and multilateral. So we have the Quad, we have the MSP, which is the Mineral Security Partnership. There's the G7, which we've been talking about, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. All of these focus on standards and financing and trying to get cooperation to happen and develop resilient supply chains. We've also been working with the United Nations, where they have a critical and emerging transition minerals panel. So there was a report that came out a few years ago, and there's, I think, a second part. India's been a key player in developing that. So that particularly looks at sustainability, like you'd mentioned. Why a lot of these countries are looking elsewhere is because of the ESG standards, just transition and how that is becoming more important. We're also part of the IEA now and the G20. So India has been doing a lot. We have been looking at the global south primarily for resources and more upstream partnerships. But we have also been looking at the global north primarily for more refining, processing, recycling. We also have partnerships with developing now with the Gulf countries, with Central Asian countries as well. So India has been looking everywhere. And I think the question now is what actually is moving forward and where it should focus on more. And I think that's something that slowly we're kind of seeing that happen. So.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, like you said, India is a late entrant to this sector, and much of our rare earth reserves are in India's beach sands and monazite, in which 50 to 60% is rare earth oxides, is currently prescribed under the atomic minerals list, which means that much of it is restricted to the state, which is sort of problematic in just being able to exploit that for commercial use cases. And like you said, 10 to 20% of India's vast geological potential has currently been explored. And since moving from the first come, first serve to the auction system in 2015, much of this exploration work has also been front loaded by the Geological Survey of India, which means it's all the more important for India to be looking outside at this point for immediate and medium term gains, because India contains light rare earths and not so much heavier rare earths. I mean, tracer elements of heavier rare earths. And it's also harder to process. We don't have the technology. So in the short term, the pain is real, and hence all of these partnerships. But across this value chain that you mentioned, the mineral-rich nations with which India has inked some partnerships, and then some with the processing, the value creation in terms of maybe magnet production, battery alliances, and finally recycling. What seem to you amidst all of these flurry of activity as things where real action is possible and is really moving forward?
I think there is real action possible in many of these. So I think with various African countries and in Latin America, I think there is definite potential there. And we have been doing a lot. We have been trying to get access to a lot of the raw materials, and we have been partnering with them with various global north partners. We have been looking at technology transfer, trying to see if there is potential for joint development of projects in third countries, and to get R&D. I think that's a key issue that we can tackle with a lot of our global north partners. But I think when it comes to a lot of the developing countries, there is this whole idea of, we've heard of resource nationalism. I think there's a sense that no country wants to just be an extractive agency in that sense. And I think co-developing projects, co-developing standards becomes very important. And I think India can play a key role in that. And I think so India needs to have very specific type of engagement models with different partners. So when we go to the global south to get resources, I think we need to focus on both our needs and their needs as well. So you can't just be extracting from resource-rich countries. You do have to probably set up plants there, look at if you can refine and process there as well, and maybe keep in mind the ESG standards to ensure that it's not too polluting, because all of those, like you'd mentioned, are key issues. And with all of the different issues of climate that are coming about, I think it becomes very important to keep those in mind. And I think when it comes to a lot of the downstream partnerships where we look at tech transfer, where we look at R&D, I think over there we have enough potential, and we have been doing a lot with many of our partners. And I think having these very specific sort of policies, so like with the US, we have something very specific on recovery and recycling. So looking at those things becomes key. And perhaps, so with the EU, we had this matchmaking event where we had different partners come together to see if many of the different companies had any sort of potential to collaborate from within India and within the different EU member states. And I think something like that could also potentially be helpful. We also have potential for triangular cooperation, and I think that is something that many countries, specifically the EU, has been looking at. I think Germany, very recently, we had the joint statement come out when Chancellor Merz had visited in January this year. And I think that specifically looks at triangular. I think the joint statement right before the FTA announcement during the India EU summit also mentions triangular cooperation. So I think that's something that we can really kind of tap into and look at. And obviously, every country is going to have to look out for themselves, and they are going to look out for themselves. So I think co-developing and having those conversations becomes important, and hence even these minilaterals become very important to look at what we can call past mineral clubs. So the Quad becomes an important platform. The G20 perhaps becomes an important platform where we can work with other countries and kind of set these standards and frameworks. And we've had conversations on deep sea mining with different countries going ahead with that. The US last year came out with an executive order that allowed for this. China's doing it. Japan, I think, tested its first pilot project. So I think developing kind of key frameworks around these, because many of these are frontier technologies or more upcoming areas, and there is no actual governance models around these things. And I think India can play a key role in helping develop those as well.
Thank you. I think that's very well put and very important for us to think about, because this is sort of a scramble where every country is out for themselves. And so unless we can find win-win situations, these partnerships will immediately fall through. I want to ask you specifically about the India-EU joint statement and the FTA, right? Firstly, what are these triangular cooperations? What would that entail? What would be some of the implementation pathways? And secondly, if India and EU were to do more in critical minerals, what would that mean in terms of on-ground implementation beyond the words on the joint statement, right? Like, what would that need? Like, would that entail processing plants being set up in India that are maybe co-invested between India and the EU? What would that actually mean on the ground?
Yeah, I think critical minerals have been potential area identified for the EU for quite some time. They have been also looking at different countries for these partnerships, very similar to what India has been doing. I think there's a basket, and the EU itself has a goal of, I think, having now, I think, 60% production within EU itself. And they had very stringent EV battery options as well, which they've kind of now eased out a little bit. But I think the joint statement mentioned critical minerals and on what triangular cooperation primarily is and it would look like is perhaps Indian skills and technology from India in, say, an African country where we can help provide skills training or knowledge sharing with setting up a processing plant within, say, an African country, and perhaps getting financing for that from the EU and helping develop the mining industry within that sector, and developing also perhaps infrastructure around that to help the communities and everything there. So I think that could be a potential model of how this triangular cooperation could occur. And the reason we already have a lot of these models with Europe. So India has been working with specifically GIZ in a lot of these African countries. So the cooperation within the climate space has not been obviously on mining. It's been more on climate resilience and bamboo and like all of these biodiversity forward sections. But I think because that model already exists, there is a lot of potential for that to go ahead. One of my other colleagues at CSEP looks at how triangular development cooperation can go ahead. And I think with the UK, in fact, we had a project a few years ago that looked at how companies can work within the triangular model. So a company from India can perhaps help companies within these African countries and get funding from a government agency from Europe. So that can also lead to these public-private partnerships models, which are global. So I think there's a lot of potential. They have some previous pilots that have happened. There are models that can be looked at. And I think that could be something that could work. And how perhaps India and EU could work just together I think for India, I think we have a huge budget now for recycling for critical minerals under the National Critical Minerals Mission. And I think with the budget, there was an announcement of these development of these rare earth corridors. And so we are seeing that the government is interested in getting more investment and setting up these plants within India. So the EU has a policy of the global gateway, which kind of allows EU countries to partner with other countries to help develop projects across sectors. So I think developing both greenfield and brownfield processing plants within India, specifically perhaps in these rare earth corridors for, say, battery materials or getting proper feedstock from different countries could be helpful. And I think that is something that we could do. We could also obviously work on the R&D side of it. Within the National Critical Minerals Mission, we have these centers of excellence, which are doing great work on developing technologies, developing indigenous technologies for a lot of the processing and recycling. Because like I mentioned, a lot of these critical minerals are technically very different. So lithium is different from brine and lithium is different from something else. And so there's within the minerals itself, there's differences, as you must know. So I think co-funding projects and having looking at potentially substitution of a lot of these minerals or like efficient use for many of these minerals, looking at if there's potential for that. And another key area where EU and India could do a lot on is framework development. And because the EU has very robust frameworks, they have very robust ideas of how to get ESG into the place and with all of that. And EU is going to have the CBAM come in, and that is definitely a contentious issue for a lot of Indian industries as well. So just to be able to tap into that and kind of align on those sort of policies could also potentially be very helpful. And the FTA kind of already eases out a lot of these restrictions, but the CBAM is definitely going to stir things up a little bit. So yeah, we can look at the Trade and Technology Council as a key potential area, because that is, with India, it's the second one that the EU has. The only other one it has is with the US. So that automatically signals that it looks at India as a potential important strategic partner. And the global gateway, there's a lot of policies in place. I think just trying to align those domestically from India and from the EU would be really helpful.
Yeah. And I think maybe one good thing about the EU is that they're not necessarily looking for regime change or necessarily domestic capability building, right? As long as they have maybe a stable supply of these minerals to import, they're happy for the capability to be built in the third country, like you were mentioning. And also, EU and India have similar hurdles in the mining phase, which is, just bureaucratic delays, not a lot of public support for mining. So some of the challenges, even in the upstream between India and the EU, are sort of similar.
Yeah.
The other thing that I wanted to learn from you is in all of these international fora that India is a part of, which is Pax Silica, the Mineral Security Partnership, or many of these, plurilateral fora, as it were, what should India really be negotiating for? I think that's a broad question, but there are potentially opportunities to do things together, right? One might be joint stockpiling, the other might be to redraw some of the supply chains, the other might just be blended finance mechanisms that Indian companies could then benefit from, because all of this flurry of activity might not really translate to much if there are no price risk mechanisms that are guaranteed by these international partnerships as well. So would some of these things entail what India would need to negotiate for? What else?
Yeah, no, I think you're completely on point with what you've said. I think specifically on blended finance and joint financing, I think the MSP has a finance network that primarily looks at these things. And like you said, financing is a key issue. And even in these triangular partnerships, if we're asking for financing from somebody else, having those standards and those things in place would definitely be helpful. So a lot of these minilateral and plurilateral platforms can work and help India do that. And I think India should definitely advocate for those things. Technology sharing as well, knowledge sharing as well, just developing carve out spaces where India can work around these things. What would substitution of technologies look like? What would recycling look like? What are these standards that have to be set in place? Even on just transition, I think the fact that India is part of this UN panel says a lot. And many of these partnerships that these platforms that we're a part of look at ESG and traceability standards. Many of these countries have very strict ESG and domestic climate standards. So governance of the supply chains, governance of a lot of the mining operations could be something that India can do. And like I'd mentioned earlier, I think having these spaces for dialogue kind of creates space where you feel like you're shaping rules together with other partners and you're not just taking rules that somebody has made for you. So I think it allows for India and a lot of the other global south countries to have a voice. And that's why being a part of these fora can help in that, where you're not just listening to somebody tell you how to go ahead and what to do. So I think climate justice, traceability, just identity for a lot of people can come about, obviously beyond just finance and technology, which are key issues and have to be worked around. And that is something that definitely these platforms can help in.
Yeah. Is there anything from your research specific to where India might have a blind eye, right? I mean, is there a missing gap across all of these web of partnerships that India has inked? I think one thing that struck out to me, and it seemed so obvious, was we don't have any deal with China. And it just seems like such a gaping hole, right? Like, is there a potential for short-term political engagement at the highest level with China itself? I mean, as difficult as that might be, or as fragile as that might be, would this help? Because rare earth magnet exports resumed last year only after a very high level diplomatic engagement. Can we preempt some of that? That was one glaring thing that came out from your report. Are there any others like that?
I think China is one of the key blind spots that we're struggling with. And like you mentioned, we're still dependent on them. So it's not like we're not cooperating with them. A lot of the trade that happens sometimes happens through third ports where we're getting materials from China, advanced materials from there through different ports. So it doesn't seem like we're working with them and so on. But I think having some sort of negotiation, some dialogue is definitely important. And like you said, last year there was some sort of a thaw in relations, and that led to more cooperation. But I think it's something that the government is looking at and they're aware of it. How that moves forward, I think we'll have to wait and see. But I think having channels for engagement is never harmful. So having those at different levels could be helpful, definitely, just to understand. And I think the only other issue not an issue, but another area that I see is actually translating a lot of these partnerships into something tangible. So we've done a lot, we're doing a lot. I think there is a lot of awareness that we have to do more, because like you said, we're a late entrant. But I think identifying what is working, what is not working, where to focus on, what to do, I think that is something that needs to be considered now, and so that we can advance things that are helping us achieve our goals and perhaps take a step back on things that are not. And I think so our paper also looks at how the domestic institutional structure within India works and who are the different players, because there's multiple players, because critical minerals is something that is cutting across all sectors. So just identifying how a lot of these conversations are taking place domestically so that India is advocating for itself internationally. I think aligning on that is important. There are obviously various channels that exist, but maybe streamlining those will also be really helpful so that we can put across points and our perspective a little better. So I think there's a lot. It's a very dynamic field. There's something happening every day. And I think papers and reports can get a little dated often because this is such a fast moving sector. So I think everybody's trying their best to understand how to move forward. And I think it's changing every day. And everybody has to figure out as it comes.
Yeah. And apart from whatever needs we may have of these materials today, India also has very ambitious net zero targets and energy transition goals. And obviously, critical minerals are key there. And also, much of this renewable energy sector today, the world leading companies are all Chinese. So, as much as we will continue to depend on critical minerals going forward, there's also this structural adversary problem that we have vis-a-vis China in this sector. How do you square the two, and broadly around India's energy security goals, if you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think energy security, economic security have all become issues now that every country is looking at. We have industrial policies in place that look at ensuring access to all the resources that we do require. And I think earlier the whole conversation was around oil from, say, the Gulf. Now the conversation is slowly shifting towards lithium and rare earth metals and having various partners and ensuring that you have enough domestic refining and recycling capacity. And I think many of the deals that we've struck, many of the MOUs that we have struck also stem from this whole idea of having energy security. And I think the question that you mentioned about Ukraine in the beginning, I think the reason the EU started looking at it was because of the issues with the Russian gas pipeline and access to gas, and the EU didn't have energy. So I think this is becoming an important sector, and critical minerals are now becoming an important sector. And I think a lot of the movement that we're seeing on this front, the development of perhaps new models. So when it comes to India's energy security in the past, when we were looking at oil, a lot of it was state driven, a lot of it was public sector driven. But now I think there is more awareness with private sector players coming in because a lot of the different countries are operating like that. Like you mentioned, China has a very similar model where you have a lot of private sector companies who are actually looking into this. And I think there is a recognition within India as well that you have to move forward along with the state and with the private sector and the market. And I think all of that is going to be the backbone for India's ambitions of net zero, of Vikasit Bharat. And I think there is a lot of potential. And I think rare earths and critical minerals are going to be the new face of India's energy security. And we have clearly been doing a lot in that space already. So,
yeah. And is the world running out of copper? There's quite some news about how copper prices have increased, how the demand for copper, specifically in AI data centers and so on, was not forecasted, and hence, A plus B equals C, the world is running out of copper. But clearly, I mean, the story needs to be a little more complex than that, right? Because in Chile, for example, mining waste contains higher grade copper than actually primary production. And clearly, at least it seems to me that in all of these reports, there's a little bit lack of imagination as to how a different world with different tech and different kind of value chains vis-a-vis replacing copper, substituting that tech, design efficiencies, all of that. It just seems like a lack of imagination. But what is your take on this?
no, I think I'm on the same page as you are. I think we've been very reliant on traditional models, or this is not even a traditional model. This is still something that is more recent. But I think there is a lack of imagination on what else it could be. So I think that's why R&D and focus on alternative technologies is something that's very important. And this whole conversation around copper, I think all of these are natural resources anyway. So after a point, we are going to be running out of them if we overexploit them. And we have to look beyond just extractive policies. We have to look beyond we have to be more, we have to have more foresight when it comes to a lot of these things. I think obviously a lot of the policies are reactive because these are immediate demands, and these are immediate demands that need to be met as well. So while we do have a lot more focus on that, I think it would never hurt to look beyond to see what the world could look like, say, 5 to 10 years ahead, which is not even that ahead in the future. And just to be more conscious that things are going to change. It's not going to be the same. We've seen that a shift happen already. So I'm completely on the same page as you. We need to be more open to more imagination into a different world.
Yeah. And maybe in this regard, an increase in price is a good thing, because then alternatives look a little more economically viable. And increase in prices of either critical minerals or copper will only force us to use them a lot more frugally and invent and invest in tech and alternatives that make that alternative world a little more feasible. But anyway, sorry, I have digressed a little. But thank you so much for joining on this podcast and spending your time and throwing light on your report. Like I said, I'll link the report in the show notes, and I'll urge all our listeners to have a look.
Thank you so much for having me. And it was a really interesting conversation. And I'm glad to have been able to have this platform to talk about the work that I've been doing. So thank you so much, Shobhankita.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.